All right, y'all, welcome to our lecture today. I'm sorry that I'm not with you in person, but you still get the joy of hearing me talk about Stalin and totalitarianism. Stalin is going to be truly one of the most brutal and horrifying dictators of human history, definitely of the 20th century. And today we're going to learn about how he takes control, how he gains power in the Soviet Union, as well as how he maintains control through this style of government. This is like dictatorship on steroids, totalitarianism, which is also a super fun word to say. But totalitarianism is total control by the government of the people. So, in order to understand how totalitarianism takes over total control of the Soviet Union, we need to understand a little bit about how that all gets created. So, as we know, during World War I, Russia experiences a revolution. This is when the Romanov dynasty, Nicholas II, is first abdicated and then is executed. And the Romanov dynasty, total autocratic czars that have been ruling with near total control themselves for 300 plus years, all goes away under the Russian Revolution in 1917. Initially, we see a provisional government that is established. Provisional was meant to be temporary while they try to figure out what to do next. And before any major decisions can truly be made, a civil war breaks out. It's going to be fought between the Red Army and the White Army. The Red Army is largely the majority of Russians, as well as the Bolsheviks. Remember, we know that Bolsheviks means majority. And they're going to fight against those that were loyal to the czars, those that did not want the czar to be removed, those that wanted to have a new czar put in its place, as well as those that were profiting off of how the system had been. So we could also see the Civil War a bit between communism versus capitalism. And as we know, the communists, the Bolsheviks, the Red Army, they win and they take over. Once they take over, not only do they say we're in control of the government, they also say we're going to have a new government. No longer are we going to be the Russian Empire. We're now going to be a union of Soviet socialist republics, meaning that Russia is a Soviet socialist republic, as are several other. There's actually 15 of them. And the Soviet socialist republics are going to be based under the themes, under the values of Marxism, under communism. And overseeing all of these Soviet socialist republics, these SSRs, is going to be Lenin, because he had been the leader of the Bolsheviks. So once the Bolsheviks win, Lenin takes over as well. And Lenin's like, yeah, I'm in power. And then almost immediately is like, oh no, I'm in power. Because the Civil War, the drought of the previous years, the famine from World War I, the reduced industrial output because Russia had been experiencing total war, all of their efforts had been going to the front lines for, at this point by 1922, going on 8 years. All of this has taken a major hit on the economy. And Lenin inherits a government and an economy that is just tanking left and right. So Lenin says, I gotta do something, I gotta fix it. And what does he do? He ironically, despite being exiled for being a communist supporter by spouting nothing but communism, what does he do? He turns to capitalism. The irony is not lost upon us. In which he says, all right, I have to get some money into people's hands because they need to put food on the table. He needs to address these very basic needs. So he creates this new economic policy in which he allows peasants to sell produce and small businesses. So basically small individuals, very poor people, they can control, they can sell their goods, and they can keep their own money. Major industries, everything else is going to be controlled by the government, is going to be under more communist, and you can't see me, but I'm using communism in quotations here, but under a command economy. The government is going to control. But individuals, they get to have their own ownership of their own wealth. And this is going to revive the economy because people are going to start trading goods, they're going to start making money, they're going to start buying things. And economies work when people are constantly buying and selling. When you have people constantly buying and selling, then money is constantly flowing, and that money, it gets more money, and that's how things increase. That's what we want in governments. That's what we want in economies. And Lenin is going to be able to achieve that. So good job, Lenin. We'll just completely ignore the fact that you just turned to capitalism in your time of need, and we'll let that irony lie. All right. So, as I said, Lenin is going to create the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Russia is one of them, and then they're going to be called the USSR. It's very exciting for them. And this is going to be under the direction of Lenin and his one party. The only political party that gets to have a say is the Communist Party. Here in the United States, we have two main political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, and there's many third parties, although they don't have much power. And these parties, they compete for our votes. In the Soviet Union, there's one party. And when there's one party, there's no competition because there's no other options for people to turn to. So you're either with the party or you're not in any party, which means most people are now part of the Communist Party. And in fact, as we'll see, little spoiler alert, it's going to become incredibly dangerous to not be part of the party. And if you're not part of the party, bad things can happen to you. So many people buy into this, especially the new elite, who are the people who are in the upper positions of the party. They are going to get perks. Their lives are going to be really good. They're going to get nice houses. They're going to get food on their table, etc. So they're really leaning into this. This is not what Marx wanted. So Lenin, he's read the Das Kapital. He's read the Communist Manifesto. He has been speaking about Marx. Marx said the proletariat, the working class, they are going to have a revolution and then they will rule themselves. There will not be a government. The government will be truly of the people. The people will be making all their decisions themselves. And instead, what Lenin does is says, we're going to have that revolution, but then I'm going to rule the people because they can't do it themselves. They need to have a leader. And spoiler alert, that leader is me. So already Lenin, in his first instance of control of the Soviet Union, he has embraced capitalism and he is undermining and completely not doing what Marx had said, not doing actually communism. So to say that Lenin is a communist, you could argue that under the true ideologies of communism, he's not. He is a dictator. He is basically doing similar things to what Nicholas, what Alexander the second and the third had done, and the czars before them, except now it's under the guise of communism, and it's under the guise of people getting to be part of the political party, that they're choosing to be part of this party and all of this stuff, but really it's a dictatorship. So fun. And it is fun. It's fun for Lenin for about 2 whole years until he dies. This is not expected. Lenin was not like super young, but he was not nowhere near death. So it's kind of a shock. And when he dies, people are like, oh no, now what do we do? Because Lenin had been leading the Bolsheviks for decades. First in opposition to the czars, then during the Russian Revolution, then during the Civil War, and then during the creation of this new country. Lenin has always been in control. So when he dies, we see a serious power vacuum is created because there had been no one in place to take his place if he was gone. So the Politburo, which is the executive committee. So it's basically like you have Lenin and then you have his people below him who help him. In our country, we have the president and then he has the executive cabinet, right? Like the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, all those people that help him run the government. The Politburo is helping Lenin run the government. Although when he dies, now they're not sure what to do. So despite this belief in collective leadership, they were like, we need to have a leader. Despite the fact that communism, Marx, Friedrich Engels, et al., they all say the people should rule themselves. The Politburo is like, we're still not going to do that. Instead, we need to find someone new to replace Lenin. There's 2 potentials, 2 rivals. Leon Trotsky, who had been the leader of the Red Army. So he was a military man. He fought in World War I. He fought in the Civil War. And then Joseph Stalin is going to be the other rival. Any guesses on who takes control? Well, if you look at the title of our notes, you know that it's going to be Stalin. Stalin's going to take control. It's going to take several years of like just agreements and, engineering and talking to people left and right. But by 1928, he's able to control the Communist Party. And within a year, he's going to get rid of all of his rivals. And by 1929, he is going to be the new leader of the Soviet Union. Essentially, he becomes the new dictator of the Soviet Union. Sidebar, just to tell you how intense Stalin is about getting rid of his rivals, because Stalin's paranoia and Stalin's intensity is something that is almost unrivaled, unmatched in human history. So Trotsky, is forced into exile. Trotsky is actually going to go to Mexico. Why? Because there's a burgeoning communist movement in Mexico, Mexico City. There's communists all over the place. Diego Rivera, Frida Kahlo. They're in love with communism. And Trotsky, he's like, all right, I can't be in Russia. I can't be with my people. I'll hang out in Mexico and at least be amongst communists. And he lives there for a while. But Stalin cannot handle the fact that his rival is anywhere on the planet. And he actually sends assassins in. Trotsky, he's sleeping in bed at night one night, and an assassin comes in, takes an ice pick, stabs him in the head, and murders Trotsky in his sleep. And Stalin's like, yes, I feel better now knowing that Trotsky is dead. That is how intense Stalin is, that you can't even go halfway around the world, be living a totally new life, having nothing to do with the government. Just the fact that you are breathing, Stalin cannot handle. You think I'm making this up. You think I'm sounding in hyperbole. I am not. This is how intense Stalin is. Also, fun fact, if you ever go to Mexico City, you can actually go to Trotsky's house. You can see the room where it happened. It's kind of intense, but also kind of cool to check out. So, fun fact of vacations that you could go to. All right, back to Stalin. So, Stalin, he's now in control. He's done it. He's gotten rid of all of his exiles, all of his enemies, because he's literally murdered them. And he is now in control. And he says, all right, I got to make the Soviet Union a stronger country. I need to compete with Europe and the United States. If you remember when we talked about the Russian Revolution, Russia has been behind the Western world for centuries. When we saw those democratic revolutions like the French Revolution and nationalism and all that spread, the Industrial Revolution in Europe, Russia was still doing their own thing. So they're hundreds of years behind, and Stalin's like, I need to compete. World War I showed that if you are not strong, if you are not competitive, you are not going to exist. As we saw, that's what happened to the Ottoman Empire in Austria-Hungary. So Stalin says we need to be a strong military, a strong industrial power. That's what we need to focus our energy in. So he is going to have these goals that he wants to industrialize the economy. He's actually going to set these 5-year plans. You can see this. That's some propaganda there on the right. That propaganda actually says, don't do it in 5, do it in 4. But Stalin's like, he's reasonable. So he says in 5 years, we're going to increase the industrial output. We're going to have way more transportation. We're going to have way more industry. We're going to be building way more tanks, way more military. We're going to increase everything. And he's successful. He increases the industrial output by like 200%. Machinery left and right. He builds trains across the country. We're seeing so many more cars, so many more military paraphernalia and everything. Like, he's very successful at this, but it comes in at an expense. Because they're focusing so much on this heavy industry, heavy machinery, heavy artillery, et cetera, they're no longer focused on consumer goods. So they're not focusing on the everyday items that people need to live their lives. And this is going to be a theme that we're going to see over and over again with Stalin. That Stalin will put the needs of the state, that will come first, and that will be a priority over the needs of the people. And that can be as innocuous here, where they're just going to focus and choose to focus their energies on different areas. And it can also become incredibly dangerous. As we see, Stalin's other major goal is that he cannot handle having any threats. Anyone who's in power who could challenge him is going to be removed. That could be someone in the Politburo who challenges. That can be someone questioning Stalin. I told you before about Trotsky. Stalin cannot handle people opposing him. It is so intense. We are going to see massive loss of life under Stalin's dictatorship. This is not just a government where the government's making all the choices. The government is actively seeking out those that oppose and getting rid of them. So this is a country that there is a massive amount of fear. It's hard for us to really appreciate and understand because it's so antithetical to how we live our life. I can question the government and be totally safe about that. Nothing is going to happen to me. You can question the government, and you should. We should always be questioning our government. That's part of our First Amendment, part of our democratic freedoms. That is the opposite of what's happening in Stalinist Russia. There is no questioning. And this culture of fear is only going to become exacerbated as Stalin's rule continues. So these two main goals that he has, he wants the Soviet Union to be a powerful country. He's successful at that, and he wants to get rid of any threats to his government. He's unfortunately successful of that, at that, whatever it is. He's successful as well. All right, so what is Stalin's government? I mentioned this in the beginning, but this is a totalitarian government. This is a totally new type of government. This is not just a dictatorship. This is not just an autocracy. This is not just authoritarianism. This is all of that to an extreme level, because the government is taking control, total control, complete and central control over every aspect of someone's public and private life. And that's the difference right there. It's not just that you're told where to live and what job to have. You're told where to live, what job to have, and also how to think. That's going to be the next level of totalitarianism, that you're no longer an individual in the state. You are part of the state and an individual second. They truly want to brainwash you. And Stalin is going to be relatively successful at this for a long time. This is the opposite of what we learned about when we went back to the start of the semester and we talked about how we started to see people questioning divine right and people questioning all these ideas and instead using science and reason that led to the Enlightenment, that led to these democratic revolutions that we've seen. So we saw kind of trajectory of more reason, more scientific understanding, etc., that progressed for hundreds of years. It's now completely gone back. So much more dangerously. So these ideas of reason and freedom and human dignity and individualism, all of that does not exist in Stalin's government. And you're thinking to yourself, how could this happen? How could Russia go from a place where there was some level of independent thought to this level of indoctrination, this level of brainwashing? Well, if you remember, under the czars, people had very little rights, very little freedoms. And then there was so much economic terribleness, just like we saw in Europe and in the world after World War I. When the economy is bad, extremism breeds. When the economy is decent, you don't see this level of extremism. But when things are really bad, people turn to more extreme rulers. They turn to more extreme tactics. They're more susceptible to more extreme types of governments. And this is the case for Stalin's Russia, Stalin's Soviet Union as well. So how is he successful about this? What are some of the tactics that are used? And we'll go into greater detail about this. But some of the main ones are indoctrination, propaganda, terror, and censorship. Some of this we've talked about before already. If you remember World War I, we saw all those propaganda posters. The goal was to get people to support the war efforts, right? Even when you made your posters, it was to convince someone to think something. There is a massive industry in the Soviet Union that is just pumping out propaganda posters left and right. So it's all people see all the time. There are constant displays of nationalism. There are rallies and parades consistently, all glorifying the state and more specifically, glorifying Stalin. So these Russian citizens, they're seeing it in their newspaper, they're hearing it on the radio, they're seeing posters everywhere they go, they're seeing people marching in the street, they're hearing about these rallies, and it's constantly the same message over and over and over again. Stalin is great, Russia is great, Stalin is great, Russia is great, Stalin is great. And when you hear that over and over again, you can become indoctrinated. Another word for indoctrination is brainwashing. So literally, this is an intentional brainwashing of people, convincing them to start thinking in a certain way around this, specifically around how great the government is. Propaganda supports this indoctrination, as does censorship. Censorship is the control of information, not allowing certain information to be told. So people are hearing messages about how great Stalin is. Look at this nice picture of him right there. There he is hanging out with some children, playing the violin. That kid's got a plane. So great. He seems so nice. People love the arts. Stalin is supporting that. Stalin is guiding that. There's no talk about how Stalin murdered millions of Ukrainians during a famine in the 1930s. There's no talk about the millions of people that went to the gulags, which were the Soviet work camps in Siberia. None of that information is shared with the Russians. Instead, it's only information about how great Stalin is, how great the government is. That's censorship, when you don't allow certain information to be shared. You're censoring. And then finally, we see terror is also used at this time because those who speak out are murdered. Those who speak out are tortured. Those who speak out never exist again. And it's not just that they get removed, they literally get removed from all trace of public life. And if this is a family member, if this is a friend who is removed, and then you speak about them, what's going to happen to you? Exactly. You're going to be removed. You're next. So there's this culture of fear. There's a bit of cognitive dissonance because you're both fearful that the government is going to murder you, and also you're spouting off beliefs and ideas about how great the government is. It doesn't make sense, but these are extreme situations that people are living in. And the government is very successful at that. We're going to see this also in Nazi Germany, in fascist countries as well, fascist Italy. We're going to see similar tactics, but in some respects, it's no more extreme than under Stalin's government because it's truly that totalitarianism, that total control. People's interior lives, their interior thoughts are being influenced by the government. It is a violation of humanity. It's a complete violation of how we interpret our lives, how we live our lives. It's the exact opposite. It's wild and horrifying to think about. Finally, the other way that Stalin is able to be successful is that he censors any other options for people to think. So religious persecution is another major element of Stalin taking over control. All the churches, and Russia's a hugely religious, the Russian Orthodox Church was massively influential in Russian people's lives. They were a very religious society. And under Stalin, there is no religion. All the churches are destroyed. Synagogues, because there was a large Jewish population that then were persecuted horrifyingly as well. They're just going to be destroyed. The police go through, and there's the police. And side note, there's also the secret police. So there's a ton of spying that's happening at this time as well. So people are constantly fearful of being watched, which is super intense. But the police that people are aware of, they go through and they destroy churches and synagogues. And they say, if you have a Bible, if you have a Talmud or Torah, you cannot have that any longer. If you have the Quran, you cannot have that. And if you're found with that, you're going to jail, you're going to the gulags, you're going to worse. So they persecute religious figures. People in the church, they're gotten rid of. And instead, because they still want to give people something to believe, they're going to replace the idea of religion with the cult of Stalin, the cult of the state. And instead, you're going to see religious iconography that no longer has Jesus in the middle, but now has Stalin. And basically, it's going to say you have nothing to believe in except Stalin. It's so wild to think about, but it's so frighteningly effective that Stalin is going to become a true totalitarian dictator in a very short amount of time. So what are the results of this time period? Stalin has almost total control of his people. He rules through fear because those that are opposed, which I realize is typed very terribly wrong, that should be those that are opposed are removed. And that is a twin effect of not only does that perpetuate fear because you saw someone speak out against the government and now they've been removed, but it also has that effect of also censorship because now you're not hearing from them. And instead, you're just hearing information from the state. The state is controlling all the media. The state is controlling all the narratives. There are no counter narratives here. It is all dominant narrative, and the dominant narrative is totally pro-government, nothing else. And we're going to see totalitarianism, as I'm saying here, indoctrination, censorship to control information. If you want to control the people, you control them through force or you control them through thought. And Stalin does both incredibly effectively. This is the most horrifying dictatorship of the 20th century. And you could argue of the entire world, all human history. Stalin is going to rule for decades through this culture of fear, through this culture of indoctrination. And as we'll see, we'll go into greater detail about these traits, etc., to see how successful he is. You are now going to watch a short video. It's actually an excerpt from a video of a documentary that talks about how Stalin uses propaganda as well as the Gulag terror system and censorship and indoctrination to control. I like this documentary because it actually interviews people who lived through the experience. You get to hear from their lives, and I think it's really important that we always think about that these are human lives. It's easy to read about them and think about them from some distant time, distant individuals that don't have any meaning, but they were everyday people like you and me who lived through this and whose experiences it is incredibly important for us to learn from as we see shifting towards authoritarianism around the world in the 21st century. It's incredibly important to understand the dangers of that, because what could occur, what we've seen from the past, is something we never want to experience again. And on that incredibly dour note, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class soon. Have a good rest of your day.